If you've been into video games for as long as me, then it's highly likely that you've acquired quite a few consoles in your time, and while newer systems from the 7th generation onwards are mostly plug and play thanks to the standardization of HDMI video output and HD TVs, where does that leave the older consoles that rely on video outputs which are no longer as universally supported? Well, that's where you're probably going to want to invest in an upscaler of some sort. These things take older video signals and turn them into a clean HDMI output and aim to scale everything properly to modern TVs. This one right here is called the RetroTINK-4K CE, with the CE standing for Consumer Edition, referring to its slightly cheaper price compared to the even more expensive RetroTINK-4K Pro. But is this slightly stripped back and cheaper version of the RetroTINK-4K still worth investing in and making a part of your retro gaming setup? Let's take a look. Before we dive into the video quality comparisons, let's first talk about the price and our first impressions of the RetroTINK-4K CE. The RetroTINK website has it for sale at $475, which converts to £357.65. However, this figure could potentially be a little bit misleading because if you include shipping to the UK, the price is bumped up to $554, which is £417.14. I was actually charged £428.76, but I did buy it back in March, so maybe the price has just slightly dropped since then. Another hidden cost to watch out for are the sneaky import taxes, which cost me £86.48 and brought the overall total cost of the RetroTINK-4K CE up to a pretty astronomical £515.24. Bear in mind the import tax and shipping costs will vary depending on where you're from, but either way you're looking at a pretty hefty investment, especially when you take all of the additional fees into consideration. The unit itself is very well built and reflects the premium price tag. The 4K CE has this slightly off-white shell which sort of matches the colour scheme of the Dreamcast and PS1, while simultaneously looking quite modern and fitting in well with some newer consoles like the PS5 or the Wii. This parity with a few different consoles will make it blend in perfectly on your TV unit, which is great because the upscaler I was previously using was the RetroTINK-2X, and that didn't really fit in visually at all. On the front of the 4K CE, we've got an SD card port, which is where the RetroTINK firmware and profiles are stored. We've also got a sliding door which hides the lower quality video inputs such as composite and S-video, so if you aren't utilising those, you can just slide the door shut and keep the front of the device looking pretty sleek. On the side of the device we have a SCAR input, and at the back we have basically every single other video input option you could ever need. Component, VGA and HDMI are all accounted for, along with a 3.5mm audio jack input and optical audio input for any advanced sound setups you might have. The only other details here are the reset button, which as you would expect will restart the device if it was to ever crash or stop functioning properly, and a USB-C input which is used to power the device. It also comes with a USB-C to standard USB cable, so you won't need to supply your own. Although it doesn't come with an AC adapter, so you might need to source your own one of those if you're providing power from a wall outlet. The other thing the device comes with is this pretty big remote, which can look a bit daunting with its 51 buttons all staring you in the face. However, you'll probably only need to use a few of these to navigate menus, with the other stuff being there for more advanced users. But let's move on and show some footage from a few of my different consoles to demonstrate the jump in quality you might be experiencing with the RetroTINK-4K CE. I'll go through the exact video outputs that I'm using for the before and after footage as we go through each of the consoles, but the main thing that you need to know in general is that I'm capturing all of this footage with an AverMedia GC573 Live Gamer 4K capture card, and I'm using the profiles created by Wobbling Pixels for all of the retro consoles that we're taking a look at. So, starting with Nintendo systems, let's look at the NES. For my before footage here, I'm using composite cables and passing it through the RetroTINK-4K with no upscaling or filters applied, effectively giving us an unaltered video output, just converting the composite signal to HDMI to allow me to capture the footage. I've got to be honest though, considering that this is only composite output, this isn't actually too bad, but it is obviously quite blurry. Moving over to the upscaled 4K CE footage though, I decided to enable a CRT filter, and this definitely helps to make the image appear sharper even without changing from composite to a higher quality cable. You can customize the type and strength of the CRT filters, but I always like to go for a fairly subtle one because I feel like the more intense it becomes, the more it starts to become a little bit distracting. Completely removing the CRT effect still gives us an image which is sharper than standard composite video, but it just doesn't look all that impressive, and the reason for that is that composite video cables just aren't that great. There's only so much that an upscaler can do when the image it's working with is this low quality. In order to improve the video from actual NES hardware, you'd really want to invest in a hardware mod like NES RGB to give it a better video output option. Moving on, we've got the N64, which is again using composite video output. However, this time because of the slightly higher resolution compared to the NES, we can see a bit more of a drastic difference in quality when it's ran through the RetroTINK-4K CE. It's not mind-blowing, but everything looks noticeably sharper and more in focus. Just look at the text at the top of the screen here, and you'll see that the before image looks a lot more blurry. And considering we're still only using composite cables here, I think this is pretty impressive. You could obviously improve the video quality seen here by quite a significant amount by simply swapping from composite cables to S-video ones, but I don't actually own S-video cables for the N64, so for now, I'm stuck with good old composite. The GameCube is one of the main systems I was looking forward to testing out here because I previously only had composite cables for this console too. I got a SCART cable months ago knowing that I was going to be upgrading my setup at some point, but because I was stuck with the RetroTINK-2X, which doesn't have a SCART input, I couldn't actually utilize the better video output until now. So this is what the standard composite video output looks like, and here is the SCART output combined with the RetroTINK-4K CE. I really hope that this drastic difference in quality is coming across even after the footage has been compressed by YouTube, because it's quite a major jump in clarity. Just look at the text here and how much clearer it is through the RetroTINK-4K CE. You might say that the bulk of the jump in quality is down to the change from composite to SCART as opposed to the upscaler itself, but the upscaler is what's allowing me to use SCART in the first place, so I still think it's a fair comparison. And I would imagine that most people looking at getting an upscaler like this are people that don't already have a SCART compatible upscaler, so I think it makes sense to show this. You might also be wondering why I'm not opting for component cables over SCART, and the simple reason for that is that SCART cables are just much more accessible and cheaper for the GameCube, and provide almost identical image quality for most games, so it just makes sense to use SCART for this system. Having said that though, for the Wii, I actually found that component cables were noticeably better quality than SCART, and I think the reason for this is that the Wii outputs in a 480p resolution when using component, whereas SCART is limited to 480i or 240p. The GameCube is also capable of 480p video output in NTSC regions, but I'm from Europe, so that doesn't really apply to me, which makes SCART more appealing. Plus, I have seen that people seem to think that the difference between SCART and component on GameCube is minimal anyway, even on NTSC systems, so I don't think I'm missing out on much there. With the Wii, however, take a look at this comparison between a raw component output and a SCART output with the RetroTINK-4K CE. At best, they look pretty much the same, but it could probably even be argued that the raw component output here looks marginally better. But now compare the raw component output with the component RetroTINK-4K CE upscale though, and you'll see that the image is definitely a bit sharper and clearer. Admittedly though, the difference here is actually quite small, but it is still great that the RetroTINK is cleaning things up a bit. Because the RetroTINK-4K CE is a 4K upscaler, it did get me a little bit intrigued as to what it could do with 1080p consoles. So I booted up the Switch, and the difference here was, well, Well, is there even a difference? I feel like I can trick my eyes into seeing some sort of difference in the colour, but the closer I look, the more I think that the 4K CE is literally doing nothing to the image. So if you're expecting this to improve any consoles already outputting video through HDMI, I don't think this device, or indeed any other device available in 2025, is really gonna do that. Let's swap console manufacturers now though and talk about the Sega Dreamcast. For this console I've actually already been using the Kaiko HDMI adapter, and while this device is amazing, its one major flaw is that this particular model of the device doesn't support any games that are incompatible with VGA video output. So while the majority of the Dreamcast library will work with this, certain games like Resident Evil Code Veronica simply become unplayable and bring up an error message. So in order to get full compatibility, I'm opting to use SCART, which is the second highest quality video output supplied by the Dreamcast, which also works with every game. Comparing the SCART upscale with the Kaiko HDMI adapter, which is effectively a raw VGA video output, is actually quite interesting. Quite clearly the Kaiko HDMI adapter is supplying a much cleaner image, which is pretty incredible considering its low price tag. But by using SCART through the RetroTINK-4K CE, we can play Resident Evil Code Veronica, so which is truly the better option here? Well, it turns out that the Kaiko adapter still holds up against the RetroTINK because there's actually a new version of the Dreamcast adapter which can swap to a SCART mode, giving it 100% compatibility across the entire library. I would be interested to see what this adapter looks like in its SCART mode compared to an actual SCART cable with the RetroTINK-4K CE. But for now, I think I'm just sticking with my SCART and RetroTINK setup purely to make things consistent across my retro consoles and to provide full compatibility. Moving on to PS1 games now though, I tend to play these through the PS2, and luckily Wobbling Pixels has supplied profiles for this exact situation, which means that PS1 content is going to be scaled perfectly even if you're playing it on a PS2. And this is probably the area where I became the most impressed with the quality jump supplied by the RetroTINK. So here's an image supplied by component cables with no upscale. It actually looks pretty good, and I could easily play through games with it looking like this. But then let's look at the RetroTINK image and just take in this difference. It's so much sharper here, and it's actually pretty crazy. Once again, we have switched over to SCART to make my setup as unified as possible, but just look at how much more crisp this footage is. PS1 definitely seems to be an area where the RetroTINK-4K CE excels, and I'm super happy with that considering it's the console that I get most use out of. PS2 on the other hand is actually a bit of a weird one. Looking at the component footage here, it looks okay. A bit blurry, but is serviceable. The SCART RetroTINK footage though doesn't really look all that much better. It is slightly more vibrant and sharp, but unless you're looking at them side by side like this, there's really hardly any difference. And this is where my main criticism of the 4K CE lies. Despite the pretty enormous price of the device, it doesn't seem to offer a good smoothing filter option, and these in my opinion make a lot of PS2 era games look much nicer because it just sort of irons out the pixelization to a certain extent. This is hopefully something which will be added to the 4K CE at a later date, because the same thing happened with the RetroTINK 5X device after its initial release. But this is a bizarre thing to not be included at launch on the 4K CE, considering the older and cheaper RetroTINK devices do have smoothing filters. But you can add some subtle CRT filters which do mask the pixelated look a little bit, but it's not really an ideal compromise. Finally, let's take a look at the PS3. I wasn't expecting much from this because it already outputs HD video, and yeah, I was right to not expect much because the two images here look almost identical. If we really look closely, you could probably argue that there's slightly more depth to the dark areas on the RetroTINK image, but like with the Switch, I wouldn't be expecting the 4K CE to be improving the image from any HD consoles. So, taking into consideration the quality improvements, and I guess the quality non-improvements here, and the total price of the device, is it worth investing in the RetroTINK 4K CE? Now this is a tough question to answer because it's so dependent on your exact situation and what consoles you actively use on a regular basis. If you only dabble in retro gaming on original hardware, then no, this is almost definitely not worth the £515.24 price tag. If you do use a particular retro console a lot, but only really one single system, like the Dreamcast for example, then I would probably also still say that this isn't worth it, and you'd be better off getting a specific product for your console, such as the Kaiko HDMI adapter, or if you had a PS2, you could get the RAD2X cable. For those of us that do frequently use a lot of different retro consoles though, the RetroTINK-4K CE would be a much better investment. Just remember though that on top of the device, the shipping and the import taxes, you're also going to need the best video cables for each of your devices, and a variety of video splitters and switch boxes so that you don't need to be constantly unplugging and reconfiguring wires. The whole thing is a little bit of a nightmare, and even my setup isn't 100% complete yet because I do need to upgrade some of my video outputs for certain consoles. But even when you do have all of the optimal equipment, I still think that the 4K CE doesn't make that much of a difference compared to some cheaper equipment with certain consoles like the PS2 and any older systems which use those lower quality video output options like the NES. So what are the other options here? The RetroTINK-4K Pro has a lot of features which would help make consoles like the PS2 look a lot better. It has more advanced deinterlacing and a smoothing filter, but it's also a lot more expensive, coming in at an enormous $750, and that's without shipping or import taxes, which, when combined, would bring the total up to £710.68, which converts to $943.85. And bear in mind that the shipping could be even more expensive to get to the US. For me here in the UK though, that's basically an extra £200 more than the 4K CE, which to be fair, if you're already dropping over £500 on a device like this, I would probably recommend that you just save up a little bit longer and get the Pro version instead. That way you've kind of just got the ultimate upscaler as opposed to one that's just a little bit lacking in a couple of areas. My real advice here though for most people would probably be to just go for the RetroTINK 5X. Sure, it doesn't scale up to 4K and only goes to 1080p, but you don't really need 4K support for these older games. It supports basically all of the same video inputs, including composite, S-video, component and SCART, with the only things missing being HDMI and VGA, which are either quite niche or don't need to be upscaled anyway. Having said all of that, the 4K CE is an excellent device. It just stings a little bit knowing that there's a slightly better product above this that I probably should have waited to get instead, and there's a sort of comparable product that's cheaper than this that I could have also have got instead. It just feels like the 4K CE is sitting in this awkward middle area where it's very good, but it also feels like you're missing out on something slightly. When the 4K CE shines though, it really shines. With PS1 games, it's literally a night and day difference between the level of quality you can achieve with this device and without it. But with consoles like the Wii, it doesn't really seem to be doing all that much. I don't know if maybe I was expecting a little bit too much here. I mean, clearly it wasn't going to make games look like they're being emulated, and the reason for that is because an emulator can upscale the internal resolution of the games rather than just the external resolution like we're doing here. But the lack of a good smoothing filter option I think really brings the device down. With this, the PS2, Wii, and maybe even the GameCube comparisons would have been way more distinct and given the device much more value. So I guess I can only hope that this is being worked on for a future firmware update. I always prefer playing games on original hardware, even if it means having to spend a bit more, but this is a pretty extreme amount of money to spend, and I would probably advise going for something a bit cheaper unless you're recording or streaming from retro consoles as a part of your career. But at the end of the day, it's your money, so spend it on whatever you want. I can't stop you. But that sums up my thoughts on the RetroTINK-4K CE. Let me know if you plan on picking up any of these RetroTINK upscalers for yourself, and if you've already got one, let me know what consoles you think were improved by it the most. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more retro shenanigans, and check out the RetroDodo Patreon if you want to support us directly too. This is Rob from RetroDodo, signing out.